Wonderful. So, welcome to today's webinar, Incorporating Musical Play into Therapies for Children. We are so delighted to have Kate Beever from Maine Music and Health here. She is a board certified music therapist and is going to talk to us about incorporating music into the lives of children with ASXL and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So, I will turn it over to Kate, who has some slides to share and will walk us
Yes.
through her presentation. Thank you so much for being here, Kate.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. So I do have some slides. Can everyone see that? Probably. Great. So I won't spend a lot of time just having you read things. I'll talk through them, and then if anyone has questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat, or I'll just open things up at the end, and you can ask it in person. We can also, if you have questions that you don't want recorded, we can also do post-recording questions, I think, as well. So keep that in mind. So today I want to share some ideas on incorporating musical play into therapy. So I'm a board certified music therapist, and we have a pretty specific training and work in very specific places, but there also aren't a ton of us all over the world. Kind of depends which part of the world you're living in if you can access music therapy. So a lot of the work I do now is actually teaching people to get comfortable engaging in music and singing with either your family member or anyone that you're caring for, and I can give you some specific ideas on how to do that. And you really don't need to be a musician in order to be able to use some of these techniques and interventions. Let me see. There we go. So the sort of legal definition of music therapy is on top: the clinical and evidence-based use of music interventions to accomplish individualized goals within a therapeutic relationship by a credentialed professional who has completed an approved music therapy program. But music has been used for decades and eons for healing and for well being and for community building. And so I like to change this definition to the use of music as a tool to improve lives and meet the physical, emotional, cognitive, and social goals of people of all ages. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Um, yeah. And so I always say physical, emotional, cognitive, and social. And that's what I'm going to focus on, going through these goal areas and sharing some ideas of ways that we can meet these needs in each goal area through music. Board certified music therapists take referrals, make assessments, create treatment plans. We work through a lot of the research base that is available, which isn't huge, but it's growing more and more as neurologists start getting interested in music. And then we create these musical opportunities. And so most of us work on a therapy team or within a child life team at a hospital. Sometimes we work in schools. Some music therapists I know only work in senior care facilities. So it's a pretty broad range of work, but this is kind of the outline. I have a cat coughing next to me if you hear weird noises. Um, and we also think through all of these different models of therapy, just as a physical therapist might think through, or a social worker, or a psychotherapist. So psychodynamic, humanistic, analytical, you may have heard of these types of therapies. And then Nordoff Robbins is a very specific type of improvisational music making that we work with kids to sort of improvise songs and play together in a group setting. And through that, they're working on all of these goals that we're going to go through. Nordoff Robbins is a great organization based in England. And when I was in grad school in New York, we had a sort of an offshoot center where we did some research, and it was really fascinating to get to participate in that. Um, Bonnie GIM is guided imagery in music, and that is using music for sort of relaxation and stress relief and processing of traumatic events. So that's usually guided, usually working more with adults. And then neurologic is something I'll talk a lot about today as well. This is using music in very specific ways to address clear goals about motor skills and speech and movement and communication. And we all work in a mixture of these things. So I usually just call myself an integrative therapist because I try to individualize things based on the client, and that's based on their needs, their background, their musical interests, and their abilities. And I'm always focusing on what people can do and what people like to do, and not, deficits. So, you can find some more detailed versions of this image online just by searching music in the brain. But a lot of people have said in the past that we have two sides of our brain, the left and the right, and some of us are left brained and some of us are right brained. And that means that not everyone is creative and not everyone can engage in the arts. But that's really not how it works. So the brain is engaged in many areas, almost all areas of the brain when you're engaging in music. And engaging means, not just listening in the background as though you're in the grocery store, but really tapping into the rhythm of the music. So even if you're listening and your foot is tapping, you don't think you're paying attention, but your foot is tapping along to the beat of the music, that's engaging your brain. And that's kind of the basis of how everything works in music therapy, is from a rhythmic perspective and tapping into that, basic beat of a song. But then we're also engaging, the auditory cortex, because we're listening to the music usually. Although deaf people can also benefit from music therapy. And then the motor cortex, so we're kind of motivating ourselves to move just by tapping into that rhythm. The visual cortex, especially if you're playing in a group and you're watching other people play instruments, or even if you're having to look down at the keyboard to pick out notes. And then the sensory cortex, we have a lot of sort of tactile toys and musical instruments that can be played with. And then, of course, did I put another image? Yes. So we're also engaging the parts of our brain that deal with meaning and memory and attention span and speech and language. Yeah, everything. And so this is kind of how it works. The sound comes in, the little hairs in your ear pick it up, and we code it into, figuring out, our brain kind of figures out where is the sound coming from in space and what is creating the sound, how loud it is, what the pitch is, how fast it is, what meter it's in. So even if you have no musical training, this is what your brain is doing to music as it comes in. So it's really firing neurons in all sides, all all parts of your brain, which is exciting. That's what makes it so useful. So getting into physical goals of music therapy, thinking about how that initial foot tapping is kind of the motivation. We can use music to engage our physical body, no matter what our physical body is going through or dealing with or can usually do. So I work with a lot of folks who have had a stroke or a brain injury, and they cannot use sort of one side of their body, or they can't use a certain limb, or their fingers are kind of stuck in a certain way. But when we start working on a musical instrument, it becomes so motivating because it's just fun. I don't know if any of you play instruments, but it's kind of a fun thing to try, sitting at a piano or sitting at a drum set. And so it just becomes very motivating to reach out and hit the drum or reach down and play the piano. And what the music therapist usually does is create a structure of a song to leave space for the person to participate. So if anyone has sung karaoke, you know that if you pick a certain karaoke song, it's already in a key that may or may not fit into your vocal range, and it's already at a speed that may or may not be something you can keep up with. So I like to listen to hip hop, I like to listen to Michael Jackson, but if I go to karaoke and put one of those on, I might not be able to keep up with it. And so live music is really what we use here. I was at my office earlier today, and then we didn't have internet, I think because there's a storm outside. So I rushed home and got on the computer at my house, but now there's, a cat and a clock. So I'm sorry about all the extra sounds. So we can really engage people's physical being. And one example of that is drumming, which is a very accessible instrument to use because you don't have to have a lot of training to play a drum. You just hit it either with your hand or with a stick. And it's not as anxiety inducing as something like a piano or a guitar, where people will sit at it and think, oh, I have to know the right chords. I haven't taken any lessons. This reminds me of music class and feels stressful. So drumming is very accessible. And I use a variety of drums in my work, mostly because that's my main instrument. I'm a drummer, and so I'm a little biased, but I also really like all the different textures and sounds and possibilities. And so I have big hand drums in my office that, stand on the floor and you can sit next to them. I have some percussion instruments that can clip onto wheelchairs or clip onto a table in front of the person so that if they're not able to hold it, it can still be in their general vicinity. And then this kind of drum is called a paddle drum because it has a handle and then it comes with a stick. And so I usually start a song either, playing something I've recorded or playing, a favorite song of the person's or just singing one and holding out a paddle drum and letting them hold a mallet. Either two mallets or one mallet in the preferred hand or one mallet in a hand that's having trouble moving. And I'll just do a little example. So if I start a rhythm, they're going to fill in the next note. And our brains kind of tend to fill in rhythm or fill in chord structures just because we're so engaged in music and we're familiar with the way that things kind of happen in order in music. It's sort of like a musical sentence. So with a rhythm, with a repeating rhythm, or with a song, or even with little jingle melodies, shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Most people, if you go, they'll go cha-cha. So you can leave space for them to fill that in, and that kind of space in the music motivates people to do something. And that something might be reaching out. It might be reaching across midline. It might be reaching up high. It might be stretching the fingers to touch a drum or to grab something that you're offering. So we're working on all these motor skills and flexibility and movement, and that can lead to muscle tone, strengthening, and just kind of being a little bit more adaptable. And the hope is that that transfers into non-musical areas. So the big thing about music therapy is the goal is not to get better at an instrument or be able to join a band unless somebody wants to do that. The goal is to kind of translate these skills into non-musical areas. Pain management and distraction is huge at my work in the hospital. Or even in people's homes, when someone is doing a non-preferred activity or getting a treatment or getting a blood drawn or something that's not preferable, we can distract the brain from both pain and anxiety and just kind of thinking about that by playing music. And pain is a huge one because pain and music are in the same parts of the brain, aspects of music. And so when you're having somebody lock into a rhythm and kind of focus on the music and breathe to it, it's literally distracting the brain away from that section that feels pain. And so there's been a lot of research on that because we're trying to use less pain meds at the hospital just because of addiction issues. And so there's been a lot more kind of funded non-biased research in that area, which is exciting. And then in the neonatal ICU, but also with some younger kids, we work on feeding through music. And there's a ton of research about that as well. For some reason, even just listening to classical music makes people eat more and makes babies and infants eat more, which is fascinating. So they've a hospital in Florida and a few other schools have created these little things that will kick on music when the baby starts sucking. And so it becomes a sort of behavioral response that you get rewarded with music that you like to listen to when you're eating. Very interesting. And then lung capacity is huge. I always start music sessions with a quick breathing exercise, which can be as simple as playing 2 chords. So we're going to breathe in on 1 chord and then out. It's very simple, and we're just kind of fixing that stress response where we're not breathing very well, so we feel stressed, and then because we feel stressed, we're not breathing very well. And that can be done with anything. So even if somebody likes listening to, I don't know, the Disney songs, you can put on Bare Necessities and do a breathing exercise to that. It doesn't have to be a slow song. It can be like, bare necessities, forget worries and your strife. You can breathe to anything. It can be a hip hop song, whatever you like. And then gate work is based in that same thing. Just you could even put on a metronome. So it just has to have a steady rhythm. It has to have a steady beat. And if someone is up and trying to walk and they're having a lot of trouble, getting a quicker walking tempo, or if they're having trouble, getting the legs to move in a straight line, you can drum in front of them, you can sing a song in front of them, sing a song next to them even, and just kind of demonstrate stepping in time to the music. And what will happen is usually people's gait straightens out a little bit and speeds up, but it might not be exactly in time with the music. So the brain is locking into the rhythm, and then it's translating to the body, and that takes a little bit of time. And so sometimes there's a little delay in the processing, but you'll see the steps even out, which is really cool. Emotional sides are what I think people are usually more familiar with when they're thinking about music, and just considering that music makes us feel good. It's hard to argue with that. Music can also make us feel bad, so that's something to be cautious about. And a lot of times when people are talking about incorporating music for relaxation into a setting, they tend to say, oh, we'll put classical music on. Like, we'll just pull up the classical station on Spotify or whatever they're using. And the problem with that is that some classical music is very intense. So if you put on a classical station and then Mahler comes up and there's like a lot of sort of dark quality to that music, there's a lot of dissonance, there's some very loud parts, it can actually be kind of triggering and to the brain and make people feel more stressed. So I always recommend, if you're going to put music on, to help someone sleep or something like that, to really listen to it first and think, is this going to help them sleep? And sometimes just keeping things really simple can be helpful. So when I go to the ICU, for example, and we're trying to keep somebody's body like out of a state of stress and they can't really participate in it, I really don't do any songs. I don't do much that sounds musical. I just kind of go in, play a few notes over and over. Can you hear the guitar? Oh, good. So only 2 chords and a very repeating melody. With infants, we always try to keep things in 3/4 time, which is sort of like a waltz or a lullaby. But it becomes this sort of musical rocking chair. So you're just going back and forth between 2 notes, and that's honestly much better than Mahler or Beethoven or whatever. Even though it's piano music, it's not necessarily relaxing. But it's very engaging. So if you're trying to engage someone, then that's a great tool to get into, is classical music. So stress relief, self-expression, because we do a ton of opportunities to lead drumming groups. We do a lot of adaptive songwriting. So one example of that would be picking a song and kind of playing Mad Libs with it, where you let people fill in their own word. So I gotta find this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. You know that song, This Little Light of Mine, I'm gonna let it shine. So that's a great one for groups, because I'll say, what are people proud of today? What is something you're proud of? And different people will have different responses to that, but you allow space for everyone to share. So one child might say, I went swimming today, or they might, if they have a talking board, they might point to swimming, or their caregiver will say, we went swimming today, and you can tell if the kid smiles or, engages, like, okay, we'll do that. So, swimming of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Tommy went swimming today. Tommy's gonna let it shine. And then even if kids, offer something that might not be a correct response to the songwriting, they might say oranges, and we'll go, oranges of mine, we're gonna let it shine. So it really doesn't matter. There's no wrong or right answer. So they're just participating in the songwriting. They're having space to kind of participate in the building of this creation that we then sing together. And that could be really powerful and empowering. So that kind of confidence can really help kids learn to start sharing things more, making suggestions, figuring out how to communicate. When given the space, it becomes more motivating, you know, especially, as parents, we're often really good at that, but other people aren't. And so being able to be in a setting with other people where they get an opportunity to be the leader, or to be given the space and time to try, can be really powerful. And that can play into other parts of life where they might need to share, I need something, or I want something. And instead of just shutting down and giving up, to really, really try and attempt to make that known. And then I always mention with the emotional side, not just for our kids, but caregivers as well. There, obviously, there's a huge amount of stress involved. And so there's two parts to it. One is that music can be used for caregivers in sort of caregiver support groups, and all these same reasons we're talking about, just finding time to take a few deep breaths to a favorite song can really reduce your anxiety level, and increase your breathing. But there's also this idea of seeing your child participating in something, and being given that space, and just kind of having fun, taking a break from all the medical stuff. So it's fun to kind of use music in this way that's therapeutic, but it's also really joyful. And I've just seen a lot of people say, wow, it's been a while since we've just been able to laugh. So cognitive. So everything I've been talking about is related to that first brain diagram, but this is where that all comes from, is this idea of neuroplasticity, and how we can kind of not necessarily we rewire the brain, reconnect parts of the brain. And that's not always possible in every area, and it kind of depends if what's happening in there. So there's a lot to think about with neuroplasticity. It's not the answer to everything, but it is possible. And we do see a lot of skills being either rebuilt or built for the first time through participation in music. And so some of these we can work on very specifically as a goal area, and some of them just seem to get better while people are playing music just for fun. So that's kind of the key, is that even if you're not gonna do a long training in music therapy and figure out how to do things really specifically, just getting instruments out and playing and having fun and singing songs together does a lot for kids. So skill building and learning can be learning musically, but also learning how to count, or learning how to spell, or learning scientific facts through music. In Maine, we all grew up learning this song, 16 counties in our state, Cumberland. And it sticks with you because it's in the form of a song. So that kind of melody and rhythm taps into the brain, and the information stays longer. I also, when I work with parents of kids who have autism and aren't very communicative, I always share that singing to them will capture their attention much better than speaking. And that can be a little hard to get used to as a parent or a caregiver, because it feels very awkward to suddenly start singing everything you say. It's pretty strange, but it is fascinating with little kids when they'll just, they suddenly make eye contact and they look at you and they're listening. Some kids really don't like the sound of their parents singing, and I'm interested to know if anyone's had that experience. But I would love to do some research on that, but I think sometimes it's a little shocking to a kid to hear your voice in such a different way, and they'll go, stop singing, or cover their ears. But I think it just takes some getting used to, and making that a more common occurrence. And so singing, transition songs when we're going from something they like to do to something they don't like to do, making music a part of that makes the transition a lot easier. Singing songs about toileting and mealtime and bedtime, all of that can really help, and especially if it's structured. So every night, like when this song comes on, we know that it's about to be, the next song is going to be the bedtime song, and that means we're going to start moving towards the bedroom. That's proven really effective for both kids and adults with disabilities, to just have that kind of musical structure. And because it's an auditory stimulus that has a lot, all the aspects of music, melody, rhythm, harmony, timbre of the instruments, someone's singing voice, it captures our attention better than just a chart that says, okay, at this time we're going to start transitioning to bed. That's not the easiest thing to implement, obviously, but if you're somebody that always has a phone on them, you can make a little Spotify list that's like, here's our transition songs, and then just be ready to take it out and play, Elsa's singing, so we know it's time to get out of bed, or whatever it is. Um, Kids also tend to have, well, everyone does, a longer attention span when music is involved. So if you're trying to get somebody to, you know, um, sit at their meal plate for a longer time, using music can help just kind of help them focus for a longer time. And then memory, you can play a lot of musical games for memory, where if you have two paddle drums or even two shakers, well, paddle drums are probably better. You can just go da 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 and have them sort of turn take with you and copy what you're doing, and then make it a little bit harder. And obviously, you want to make rhythms that are physically possible for the person you're working with. So that changes based on what their hands and shoulders and fingers are able to do. But just kind of playing these little memory games where they have to copy what you did, and it gets harder and harder with time. And then there's some really interesting research on seizure reduction with music, which I'm kind of a skeptic in at my baseline, and so I was skeptical to read about it, but it is pretty fascinating. And so I guess specifically with temporal lobe epilepsy, there's a lot of research around how music is processed in that same area of the brain. And so people who play music on a regular basis will have fewer seizures than when they're not playing music, even non-musicians. You also have to be careful because in a very few cases, this is a really uncommon occurrence, but seizures can be caused by loud noises in music in a few people. So just really knowing your audience and knowing the person that you're working with helps. But that is some fascinating research. I think it was out of Ohio State. So if you want to read more about that, there's a lot of stuff about the relationship between stress and seizures and how playing music reduces stress. So that might be part of it, or it might be dopamine related, or our mirror neurons. There's a lot of things it could be related to. But something to think about if you have a family member that has a lot of seizures. There we go. Social is sort of like emotional. I feel like this is another kind of obvious benefit to engaging in music, where we get to play with other people, whether it's one other person, whether it's people on a Zoom call, or whether it's a group of drummers playing together at school. And being in a group like that and playing instruments gives many opportunities to interact with others that work on these goals of leadership, turn taking, both modeling and being modeled, like getting to be the leader, or copy a rhythm or play a rhythm that other people copy. The mirroring idea, where someone is doing what you're doing, is incredibly powerful. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a dance game that kids will play at school sometimes where one person moves and the other person copies it. And I recommend trying that at some point, with your spouse or a friend or something, because it is very powerful to see what you're doing reflected in others. And that's true musically too. If you play a rhythm and everybody's, intently watching you and trying to follow the rhythm, even if it's not super steady, it just feels really empowering to realize that everyone is following you. And then interrupting is a good interaction that can be practiced. A lot of our kids do not get the opportunity to interrupt. Like they're, either not processing a little bit slower than other people, or cannot, verbalize what they want to say. And so they get interrupted a lot, but they don't get that chance. And so when you give somebody a drum and they can just whack it in the middle of the group and it's accepted, and everyone can kind of laugh, and it's not It's not like that was the wrong time to play. It's just a nice chance to actually get to do something loud and silly, and playful. And then communication through these groups. I will sometimes have shakers. Did I bring any? Oh, I only have my lemon shakers. When life gives you lemons. So just having a kid, play the shaker and then pick somebody to pass it to. And then maybe they do a little thing where they shake it really fast and the other person shakes it really fast back. And then the next person will choose someone else to bring the shaker over to, and they can do it either slow or fast or in between. And all of this communication in context of music making is nonverbal. So it doesn't matter if people speak different languages, speak in different ways, either with, language or a computer. Doesn't matter if people don't speak at all, because we're communicating through the use of musical instruments and sounds, even tapping on a table. So that's very powerful as well. And then making choices is a huge part of music. And when I do a group, I often put out all the instruments in the middle, and then I allow each person to come up and choose an instrument. And that can actually say a lot about what someone is experiencing that day. With adults, I find if they choose a really small instrument, they're probably just nervous to make a lot of sound in the group. But with kids, you can kind of see what energy level they have or how they might be feeling, and so they can express a lot just by like the choice of instrument and then how they play it. Like, are they playing really loud? What does their facial affect look like while they're playing? So it becomes kind of a assessment tool as well, is just seeing what instruments people choose. And then I think I already mentioned distraction during procedures. I don't know why I put that in social, but it works. So these are just some sort of tips and hints I have if you're going to get instruments, or use music at home or in school. Number one, there's no wrong notes. So I wish I was at my office, because I would be sitting at the piano and could play some things for you, but I like to use really accessible instruments, not just physically accessible, but musically. So if you pick instruments that are in a pentatonic scale where there's only 5 notes, there's no 4 and 7. That might not make any sense to you if you're not a musician, but if you go to a music store and say, I just need a pentatonic instrument, they will know what you mean. And essentially, then you can play anything together and it'll sound good. It'll sound happy and appealing and not crunchy and dissonant. And no one will feel like, oh, I'm not a good musician, because it'll just be a rewarding experience, which is what we want music to be. So not correcting the person. Again, music therapy is not about being a good musician. And then focusing on a steady beat, which is harder to do than it sounds. But no matter what you're doing, you want to have that kind of like heartbeat in the back of it. Da 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 da. Elmo's World. Doesn't matter what song it is, there's always going to be this beat. It might be faster. I got this feeling. I got da 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 da. Whatever it is. But there's always a beat that sort of causes you to tap your toe to the song, because that's what is going to help our brain lock into the music. The third thing that's huge is leaving space. And so if I'm working with somebody on speech through music and I want them to fill in the last word of a song, I'm trying to think of an example. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun, and I say it's all. You know what the last word is. And so you want to say, right, it's all right. That's not a great example, because I don't have a lot of kids that are working on the word right. So we pick songs that use either the vowel sounds or the consonances or the specific words that we're trying to kind of improve our mouth's motor ability. But we leave a ton of space, because all of us, or almost all of us, have a musical brain, even if we're not a trained musician, and our brains want to fill in that space. So it's kind of like if you went to the orchestra and they stopped to measure early and they all packed up and went home, and you would go home and think like, oh my gosh, my brain hurts. That last note needs to be played. That's what happens in, 15 seconds in music. But what happens when I'm working with a child and their caregiver is there is often like the caregiver's brain is doing that too. And so they'll be like, right. They just cannot wait. And a lot of our kids are processing at a different speed than us. And so we have to wait quite a bit longer sometimes, but it will happen. Like they'll say it, or they'll reach out and strum the guitar for the last note, or they'll reach out and hit the drum for the last note. And you just have to be patient. And it's kind of painful sometimes because you do want to sing the last note. So just sing it in your head. My fourth point, which is arguable by some people, but I really prefer that people don't use music as a reward for non-musical behaviors. Like if you eat 3 more bites, we can listen to your favorite song. It is really effective. And so, just like with like screen time, I can't blame or judge anyone for doing it, but schools do it a lot, and it really bothers me because I think music is so rich in opportunity for expression and emotional regulation and just kind of exploration and communication. So it should be available all the time for kids to express either by singing or listening to music or playing instruments. And so it's disappointing if it becomes something that they feel like they will only get if they do X, Y, Z or behave in a certain way. And it's a very safe way to express anger and like difficult emotions. You'd rather they are playing a drum. Sometimes we cover our drums in blankets so they're not so loud. But you'd rather they do that or listen to really heavy music than, be physically violent or something. And then the other piece of advice is to make your own instruments. So at around Easter time in the States, I always collect a whole bunch of those little plastic Easter eggs and that you usually fill with candy, and I fill them with rice or beans and tape them up, and they become egg shakers. And that's a great activity to do with kids that will then become instruments. You can make your own tambourines, all sorts of things. But there's also I have a lot of recommendations for if you want to actually buy instruments to use. And I think I have a blog about that, so I can send it out if people are interested. And incorporating visuals is great too. When you do a song like Old MacDonald, you can have either pictures or little toys of different animals and let them choose what animal is going to be next. We do Down by the Bay a lot. Down by the bay where the watermelons grow, which is great because you're choosing an animal and then you also have to come up with a word that rhymes with the animal. So that's fun, especially for older kids, but to try to work through together, like what is rhyming and how do we choose a word that sounds like the animal. So I see some questions in the chat, and I think that's everything. So I'm gonna see if I can read the chat. And if you want to come off mute, you're welcome to as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Most of the questions are just about some audio issues that we were having. But I think my internet cut out actually in the middle of that, thanks to our storms. But yeah, if anyone has questions, please come off mute and ask them, or you can put them in the chat now, and I can help facilitate that.
Awesome.
I have some questions.
Sure.
You mentioned something about musical therapy being beneficial for those that are deaf. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure.
After the clock is done?
After the clock is done. Yes. So I used to work at a school that had a deaf preschool, and I worked with my sign language is sadly limited at this point because I don't use it very much anymore, but I worked with one of the teachers who was also deaf, and we had a lot of fun bringing in instruments and sort of different sensory things to try with kids. And so we would bring really big drums. There's like a gathering drum that's kind of table sized almost, and you put it in the middle and all the kids can put their hands on it and drum together. And then we would bring in guitars. So this is a small guitar that I use when I'm kind of traveling, but bigger guitars that we would then detune to an open tuning. So like an open D or an open C chord. And then when you strum it, you can feel the vibration of the note, And then because it's in an open tuning, all you have to do is one finger or even a capo bar over. Um, I wish I could demonstrate it, but what it would sound like is a blues. So you'd have, this guitar is not in tune. I'll just detune it. So you'd have an open chord, and then you could play the 4 and the 5 chord, and there would be the experience of like the blues. Dun da da dun da da dun 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 da dun. Dun dun da 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 dun dun da 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 da, which is really familiar to most people, in Western countries, and it's familiar to kids too. So even the bass line of that, when kids feel it on the drum, like they know when it's going to change, and that expectation kicks in even when they can't hear it and have never heard music. It's fascinating. They'll still participate. And it's also a great opportunity because it's so sensory and so visual, to have some of our kids who have hearing loss participate in a music group with kids who can hear, because they can still play, they can follow the rhythms, they can, hold an instrument someone else is playing and feel it. And it's just an opportunity to participate where they're really not missing out, because we're not, you know, singing songs or doing, we're not talking through things. We're just drumming or
Right.
strumming.
So you mentioned a couple of times that, like, especially with a drum, from a sensory standpoint, that it's, I guess, from a tactile sensory standpoint, have you noticed that even if the kids are not touching the instrument, if they're not comfortable, they're drawn in,
Mm-hmm.
are they still, even if it's just, say they're, what am I really asking? I'm asking if they can feel it without actually touching it. If it's in your experience, are they feeling the frequencies go through the space without actually, say a kid is in there that is blind and deaf, but they're certainly, we all know that there are other senses that we can't, in the current paradigm define.
Yeah, exactly.
But have you had experience with that personally, or have you picked up on that by working with some of these clients?
That's probably true. I can't say whether I've noticed it or not, but there are some, actually not kids that I can think of, but adults I work with who have real sensory issues. They don't want to touch the instruments, and they have hearing loss. And so for them, it'll be more about making the floor vibrate, or making like something that their wheelchair vibrate or something. So that's a little bit different than what you're asking, but I do think, and I'm sure there's research to it, that there's a lot more to music than we have studied and that we know about, through science. And it's clear that, it's powerful stuff. And so there's definitely an aspect where people are engaged with it when they can't hear or see or touch it. It's like they still are kind of drawn into the group. I don't have a lot of people who just don't want to participate at all, and if they do, it's usually because they're in a lot of pain, or they're having a bad day, or they're just exercising their right to say no, which is, music is one of the only times they can. So I always respect that. It's like, you don't want to play, you don't have to. But yeah, that's interesting about, I think a lot of people, there's a different field called sound healing, where people study sort of the, qualities in space of sound, and that's a totally different field. So I can't speak to it, but I think that might answer that question a little bit as well, as just like where that happens.
It's kind of related to what you were, not to take the floor from everybody, but also related to, so my daughter has seizures as well. So there's like a lot going on here. And we've kind of seen some of what you mentioned. I mean, I can't like tabulate it as data, but it's interesting to hear somebody else pick up on it. And you had mentioned that, music, it's ancient. And sound healing is something I'm not super familiar with, but I have looked a little bit into it, and kind of related to one of the questions that somebody asked a minute ago. Have you found that, certain chords or frequencies can affect certain parts of the bodies or certain situations, or if there's a trauma situation, or maybe not even trauma, but a situation of a lack of ease, breaking the nervousness. I've even read that different organs have, like body organs have certain frequencies. And that's where, so that is true.
I just shouldn't speak to it because it's a very different field. So the field I'm in is it's kind of like differentiating between Western and Eastern medicine. That's kind of how I would think about it, or like physical therapy versus yoga and meditation,
Hmm.
where all of it is extremely beneficial, but there's sort of different fields of study that you can circle around. And so sound music therapy is this sort of Western 21st century profession, whereas sound healing goes back to ancient times and sort of native traditions. And there's people who do study it and practice it. And I have met a lot of people who have benefited greatly from it. And that's where they do study like certain organs and certain parts of the body and chakras respond well to very specific tones and sort of hertzes. And so there's ways to kind of practice that. But I just always caution, I've met like people who are managing cancer and they'll say, I'm going to stop taking my meds and I'm just going to do this sound healing practice. And I don't recommend that. But I
Right.
think as an addition and just like trying new things, certainly something to look into for sure.
Yeah,
Understood.
great. Thank you. So we have a couple questions from the chat to relay here, Kate. So one is, we'll go with this one first. It's sort of related to the previous questions. Are there chords that are preferable in music therapy?
No, I don't think so. So I have a little girl that comes to my office every week and she's very independent. She's 9 now. Wow, she's 9 now. And she has gained a lot of function. She was, born with some difficulties and some heart problems and lung problems, and so she now, like, her dad comes with her, but he waits in the waiting room, and she wheels herself in. She sits right at the piano, and she just starts playing things. And it's amazing to see because she didn't used to have much functioning in her hands at all, and now she's able to like play fingers independently and all sorts of things that I hadn't even had in my mind as goals. We were just kind of working on expression. But she'll play, she doesn't know how to play the piano. A lot of people don't, and she'll just play notes. And so she's just choosing things that she likes. And sometimes they're very crunchy and dissonant. And what, if I were a music teacher, I would think, well, that's the wrong note. That's not a chord. But instead, I think, wow, what does this sound like and what does it mean? And so, even if it's a minor chord or a really dissonant, like minor augmented seventh or something, I will just either match it so that she can hear what it sounds like hearing it back, or I'll create a structure below it, like a little bass line, boom, 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 that kind of adds to the mood of what she's playing. So, I really don't think there's any correct chords for different behaviors. It's really just about what the person is trying to communicate and express through the music they're making.
Thank you. And next question, is music therapy something that's typically covered by insurance?
That is a good question.
And this will be a very US specific response, I think, here.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, unfortunately, our healthcare, but yes, actually it is. Most national insurances will cover music therapy. It has to be for specific reasons. So there's certain billing codes that we use for different things. So if we're working on like physical goals, we'll bill differently than if we're working on speech or communication. It's a little bit harder if you're just coming to music therapy for stress relief, which some people do. I'm licensed as a therapist, so people come when they're going through divorce or something and just want to try something different. That is harder to bill for. And then, unfortunately, like Medicare, and Maine Care do not cover music therapy unless it's in a long-term rehab situation. Like, there's very specific things, and it's pretty frustrating, and it takes some advocating, but usually, just getting the right person on the phone at the insurance agency, which who knows how long that takes, that usually makes it happen. And then also having a doctor's note can kind of move things along more quickly.
Thank you. And another question from the chat, someone says, I'm thinking about getting some instruments for Christmas for my daughter. Do you feel like a ukulele and a steel tongue drum are accessible for a beginner musician?
Yes, definitely. Again, I wish I was at my office because I have so many instruments there. But yeah, ukuleles, kind of like what I was saying with tuning a guitar differently, they're in an open tuning, so you can just strum and it sounds great. And yeah, the tongue drum is really interesting. That's an example of an instrument that's in a pentatonic scale. So there's no wrong notes. Anything you play on it is going to sound pleasant and rewarding. And you can tap it with your hands or with little mallets. So those are great, great examples. Yeah. Did I miss any?
Other questions from people who would like to unmute or come on camera and ask a
I see
question?
something about, yeah, funding. Yeah, a lot of music therapy programs too are grant funded. I have trouble sometimes with like the way nonprofits want to use music therapy because they just want like, pictures that their donors will like. And I'm like, well, it's still therapy. So I don't really want to like just take pictures of people getting therapy. But it is a popular thing for grant funding. And so that's often when I do groups, it's usually funded by a grant and then people don't have to worry about paying for it.
So a question, so my grandson has been diagnosed with Bainbridge-Roper syndrome. Is there anything specific you'd recommend trying with him? He's 4. So maybe a good way to approach this question is if you have someone who's new to music therapy, what would you recommend as some starter goals or places to start?
Yeah, I think sort of assessing with any kid, assessing what they can do and what they respond well to. So sitting facing the child with a drum between you or a piano between, whatever you have access to, really. If you have an iPad, there's a lot of free music making apps where the kid can just like point to a circle and it'll make a sound, and then they point to a different circle and it adds a sound. So playing with things like that and just seeing, is the child engaged in music? Does it seem like they're even interested? If you sing to them, do they make any vocal sounds back to you? And it's, every child is different. Even kids with the same syndrome obviously have a huge difference in the way that they function in different areas. But if you know that a child is having trouble with speech, then can you engage in any kind of vocal play, and not just singing, but do 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 do, just making like silly sounds with your mouth and seeing if the child plays back can really tell you a lot about what might help.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one final question. If there are any last ones percolating here.
And if stuff does come up later, you're also always welcome. I can put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to contact me, because I love sharing ideas. And I'll try to send that blog out with the instrument recommendations too, if I can find that somewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Sorry we had some connectivity issues with this big storm that's moving through here in the Northeast, but appreciate your patience, and I will share the recording by email after the session, and hopefully the audio is clear in the recording. So Kate, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and for sharing your expertise. And I know this will be a session that gets watched over and over again into the future beyond just the folks who are here with us today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
Thanks so much. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too.